when he decides to kill the rabbis, he makes that he comes to the rabbis and he says, "You have been chosen to be killed because of what Joseph being sold by his brothers. Joseph was sold by his brothers, therefore no one has ever paid the punishment. We've never had 10 such great rabbis all living in the same generation. We have one generation, 10 rabbis, and we're going to kill you." Now, how exactly it plays out over many years, the actual death of these people, is a story for a different time. But so what they do is the rabbis say, hold on a second, who said that we were supposed to be killed for the work of Joseph and his brothers because of what they had sold him? Who said what they had done was necessarily such a bad thing? So what they got was they made a lottery, and whoever was going to go on a lottery, he was going to have this spiritual elevation and enter into this paradise state while he was down here, and he would be the one that would he would be the one that would have to go up on high to request or ask from God whether they have to be killed. So they do this lottery. The one that it fell on was Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol. And it's a very powerful part, that part of the davening, where he goes up and he comes and he meets the angels. And he says to the angels, this king wants to, the emperor, the Roman emperor says that we have to take the place of the brothers of Joseph and be murdered for having sold him, because the Torah says that a person that kidnaps another person has to be murdered. So are we the ones that have to suffer the consequences for that? And the voice comes out saying yes. And the angels say, hold on a second, these are great people. Is this their punishment? This is what they deserve. And God says, quiet, this is what has been decreed. In other words, don't try to necessarily understand, because the understanding is not necessarily so obvious. So anyway, the leader of the Jewish people at the time, or the official Nasi, was Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabban Shimon, the author of today's Mishna. He is dragged out to be killed together with Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol. They were very good friends. They were very close. The Kohen, the high priest, were both very spiritual giants and great people. And they both plead to the emperor to please kill themselves first, that they should have the honor of being killed first. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, I want to be killed first. Why did he want to be killed? He didn't think he'd be able to handle watching his friend being killed in front of him. And Rabbi Shmuel felt the same. So Rabbi Shmuel said, I am the high priest, and therefore I should be able to get killed first. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, but I am the Nasi. And the emperor sided with Shimon ben Gamliel, and Shimon ben Gamliel was killed first in a brutal and very unpleasant manner. But that's just a little bit of a history behind Rabban Gamliel. That's his passing. But as a leader, as the Nasi, he instituted some very important concepts. Number one, he was the one there's a concept of that the rabbis are told by the Torah that they have to vasu siyag Torah. They have to make a fence around the Torah to protect the Torah. And what that means is that if the rabbis see that people are failing in a particular law in the Jewish Torah, they have to make another law to prevent people from transgressing the original law, so that they would not come to transgress the main biblical law. That's called making a fence around the Torah. They have to be very careful when they make those laws to make it clear that this is a rabbinical law. Now, we've had hundreds of these cases throughout history, and these are what we call rabbinical laws, of where they are there to protect people from transgressing. The famous one of this is, for example, an Eruv. An Eruv is where generally on Shabbat, we're not allowed to walk in a public domain, right? We're not allowed to carry in a public domain. But there are certain times that it's not 100% the public domain, and therefore the rabbis instituted that there's a way that you can carry. biblically. But the problem is that the street is still an open street, and people would then get used to the fact that they are just carrying, and they would get used to being able to carry anyway. And then what would happen is that people would be carrying in the streets which are legally allowed to be carried because they're not considered a biblical public domain. So what ends up happening is they forget the law, so to speak, and they carry anywhere. So the rabbis instituted something called an eruv, where they have to make a sign and they have to mix the meals together. They have to make it as though they're one house. And that's what we have in the Melbourne eruv, for example. We're allowed to carry, and it's still a controversial thing because the question is whether they have overly extended. There's some opinions say that that's an overextension. And that's why, even though halachically it's acceptable, there are some people that still won't use an eruv for various reasons, discussion for another time. But that's a famous example of where they made this decree that you can't just carry in a public space, even though biblically you might be able to, because that would lead you to carry in a biblical public space because you would not know the difference. And there's hundreds of such examples within Jewish law. Now, what Rabban Shimon Gamliel was unique in his role is he was very strong about emphasizing that if the Jewish community was not able to withstand the new decree, that new decree automatically falls away. Now, this is a precedent that way precedes Rabban Shimon Gamliel, but he really stuck up. The famous example of this is that Ezra wanted that every time after men and women are intimate, one with the other, that the man, before he prays the next morning, he has to go to the mikveh. Ezra had his particular reasons of why he wanted to make this decree. He made the decree, and what he saw is that nobody was abiding by the decree. People were finding it too difficult to abide by the decree, and therefore the decree automatically became nullified. In other words, the rabbis make a decree, but if the people do not abide by the decree automatically falls away. And that's happened numerous times over Jewish history. But once the decree was accepted and done, then it cannot fall away unless it was initially made as a temporary decree. So these are just an introduction of understanding Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's personality and things that he worked on. Famous example, not on famous, but a story of where Rabban Shimon Gamliel was very careful about making sure that the people can live up to what the expectation was. We know that there's a certain quota of doves that had to be brought as sacrifices, and things like that. But once the people that were selling the doves decided, hey, the Jewish people need doves for sacrifices, and especially the poor people needed doves if they couldn't afford the more expensive sacrifices. So what did they do? They put the price of doves to be extremely high. So what did Rabban Shimon Gamliel do? Rabban Shimon Gamliel cut down the amount of doves that would be required to a bare minimum. What did ultimately that achieve? That achieved, as you can imagine, that these people were selling no doves. Instead of, because they thought, well, people have to buy doves because they need to have a certain quota of doves, by him reducing the doves, the required amount of doves, what he ultimately achieves is that they don't need that many doves. The merchants now lose all their money because they see what Rabban Shimon Gamliel has done, and therefore they're forced to lower the prices. When they lower the prices again, then he picks up the ratio of how many doves have to be brought back to normal. And this is something that has been done. Things like this, there's numerous stories of other great sages doing these type of things over the generations. One more famous thing that we know about Shimon ben Gamliel is that we're told that he was a big celebrator of the Simchat Beit HaSheva. Every year on Sukkot, we know there's a very big party where the Jewish people all celebrate. We celebrate the water libations on Sukkot, and people will dance all night when they actually drew the water. It's called the celebration of the house of the drawing of the water. And discussion, we spoke about this on Sukkot. One of the famous rabbis that used to juggle and do all types of tricks, which some people thought was disrespectful, but taught them that actually it's not disrespectful, was this gentleman, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Okay, so that's a little bit of a history about Shimon ben Gamliel. Now let me actually look at the at what his teaches us today. Okay, so he starts off by saying, which is really a next part of his history, another point about his son, Shimon Benoi. He's just called Shimon. Who was his father? His father was Rabban Gamliel, as we mentioned before. Now, what did he say? He starts with saying, Kol Yomai Gadalti Bein HaChachamim. Now, there's lots of meanings of what this means. All my days I was raised amongst the wise. Now, you would say, my days when I was young, I grew up amongst the wise. His father was one of the wisest people in the time. But why is he saying, Kol Yamai, all my life? Now, what is he saying? Is this saying that he never considered at any moment that he was no longer a sage, he living or studying from the sages. He was always learning from the Chachamim. So he says, I've always studied, always lived amongst the wisest people that I knew. And I want to tell you the greatest tip that I learned from all these people. What's his greatest tip that I learned in my life growing up amongst the wise? This. Lo matzati leguf tov mishtika. I found nothing better for the body than silence. How's that an interesting thing? You know, I would like you to find any person in the world today that would come up and say, you know, I've studied everything and I'll come out, the final thing is to be quiet. What does he mean? So there's lots of layers of meaning in this statement. But before we get into all the different layers of meaning within the statement, let's us first finish off his statement. He says, V'lo ha-medrash ikar, not the study is not the most essential. Ela hamaaseh. The most important thing for a person to do is actually action. And then he goes on to say, V'chol hamarbe dvarim mevi chet. And anybody that talks too much ends up, excessive talk and speech brings one to sin. So what does this mean? What does this mean? Kol yamai gadalti ben hachachamim. So he starts off by he tells us, what would you think he's telling us? If you had an opportunity to study from the wisest people, what's the most important thing to do? So he says, well, surround yourself. We've spoken about right at the beginning, spoke about the rabbis that said, surround yourself by wise people. But then do what? What are you got to do? We spoke about a few tips earlier, but he says, what I found is that I was always trying to answer and question and join conversations. Great, very important. But he says more important is the shtika. What's the shtika? The shtika is being quiet and listening. Simply listening to what people have to say. And this is this is mainly applies to what it applies to all people. Oh, what happened to my camera? One second. Could you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
We can hear you. You've probably got a bandwidth problem.
Let's try that again. Okay. So he says that the most important thing I found was the concept of being quiet. But what does quiet mean? So obviously it means to sit and listen. Don't try to come up and always have your own interpretations or argue. That's important. But the most important thing is the ability to listen to those wise people. It also is this. There's another statement that we have in the. It's actually part of it is from Pirkei Avot. It says, if you are quiet, what he's learned is what happens if you are publicly embarrassed. People insult you. They call you names. We're told that the natural reaction of a person that is been offended or embarrassed or shamed, especially if it's publicly, is to reply. So he says, I found that people that don't reply, that remain silent, after being publicly embarrassed, ashamed, end up getting the greatest reward. They end up coming up on top, and it's a tremendous blessing. And there's a statement from Chazal that say that if you have a person that is insulted, a wise man, what is a sign, or one of the signs of a wise man is a person that hears his shame and his embarrassment, his called names or whatever it is, and he does not take offense from it. But more than not only not taking offense, he actually does not reply at all. And then he says he continues to shine like the sun. So the natural way of a human being is that when you are insulted, what do? You insult back, you reply, you defend. And maybe sometimes, this is just my own words, sometimes that may be justified or the right thing to do. But probably more often than not, the best thing to do is to be silent in the face of insults and shame and curses. And it says, be like the sun, you'll be compared to the sun. Why compared to the sun, say the Chachamim? Because what does the sun do? The sun sometimes is shining. It's his time to shine. And who appears while the sun is shining? Who has the audacity to come while the sun is shining? Sometimes the moon. The moon has his time. The time of the moon is the night. But every once in a while, during the day, the moon comes out too. So what does the sun do? Instead of Chodesh Tov, thank you. Good for reminding me for Chodesh Tov. What does the sun do? It reminds us, it doesn't stop, it's not fazed by the moon's entrance. It continues to shine and it becomes unaffected. At most of the time, you won't even realize that the moon has appeared. So he's saying the same thing, is that if you could just continue to do what your thing is and not to pay too much attention to the insults and shaming of that people have given you, you remain silent, and what will ultimately happen, you will be able to overcome those hardships. So there's more that we could talk about in this particular, the silence. And Chassidus talks a lot about how siyag lachachma shtika, the border around chachma is shtika. Shtika is the humility. We're told that he says over here, he says, all my days I grew up amongst the wise. Why does he say all his days? Because even when he was considered the greatest, he was the Nasi, he was the greatest, he always considered himself a student of his fellow teachers, of his colleagues. He was always there, the first one to listen to what they say. He may have been the wisest man over there, having learned for his entire life from all the other great sages, but he never found that the other people didn't have what to teach him. He always had what to learn from other people. And that's why he says, Kol yamai gadalti beina chachamim. I always studied amongst them my entire life. And what I realized is by always listening, I was always growing in my study. And that's why he says his entire life. Now, the next part of the Mishnah becomes I want to show it to you again, the last part of the Mishnah. I want you to see these words. These are very important. This became the same statement is mentioned numerous times in Pirkei Avot in different forms. He says, "V'lo medrashik." The essential thing is not study, but deed. Now, this line became a tagline. So there's a variant of this line which says "Hamaisa or Ikar." This line became a tagline of the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement, basically, prior to the Hasidic movement, there was this kind of all the most Chachamim, most of the wise Torah scholars, believed that what was all important was Torah study, and having any interaction with any lower people of less knowledge or whatever it was of little importance. If you want to read more about this, is the previous Rebbe wrote a whole book of memoirs a book called Memoirs of, and a lot of it talks about the time and the way people spoke prior to the Hasidic movement start, or in the early days of the Hasidic movement. And one of the major things that they wanted to teach is that as important as education and scholarship and extreme studying is, ultimately, what's more important is the actions, being a good person. So you're going to see this concept coming out throughout Pirkei Avot. But what's really incredible is that the only people over the last the century or two before the Hasidic movement, this statement was almost forgotten. You would have thought they had separate synagogues for scholars and for lay people, because scholars were above the lay people. They couldn't interact with them. They wouldn't be allowed to join in the same services. They wouldn't talk to them. They were like low lives, unimportant people. They went to them when they needed them. And this was one of the concepts that the Hasidic movement fought vehemently against. That the main thing is, yes, study is extremely important, but the main thing is the action. If you have a person that is a good person, that does Torah, does mitzvot, that fulfills the law, it's all great that you could know everything, but if you don't act upon it, it actually becomes worthless. And we'll see, as I said, we'll see this in different variants later on. This whole thing of v'chol marbe Dvorim may be chait, that one who speaks excessively brings sin, is it's actually something that we learn from Chava, that Eve eventually actually fell in her trap because she overly excessively spoke, which is an interesting concept that they learned, that she was talking too much to the snake, and she entered into the conversations with people that she or creatures that she didn't have to. But basically, what it's telling us, besides for all the deeper meanings, is that if it's all about talk, as we say famously, talk is cheap. If you're not going to make the focus of your talk, your outcomes, the actions, what is you actually trying to do, your talk ends up bringing only to sin. And what's the sin? The sin is all different types of sin. But the main sin, the most basic sin, it's the sin of time wasting. So if you see, he starts off with the shtika. What's the greatest thing? Is shtika, being quiet. What does that mean? Because the shtika means that you have time to listen and learn from the elders, from the wise people, and from all people. But also, if you're going to just talk and talk and talk, you end up thinking too much about yourself or about your own opinion, and you also end up wasting your time not studying itself enough or doing enough good actions, good deeds. So that's the basic understanding. I want to conclude with a story. By the way, I'm really giving this a very shallow explanation today, just because of the timing, where we're up to. But I want to just conclude with a fascinating little story. And I don't know how true the story is, but it's written down in different books about a rabbi that is brought to a community to teach them. And when he comes to the community, he tries to teach them about the mitzvot, about doing this deed, about how about you take on the mitzvah of mezuzah and tefillin and kosher. And they all said, listen, we're all good people. We don't have any situations over here where no one's stealing and no one insults and no one's killing and everyone's very nice. We're all nice to each other. Why should we start doing all these other mitzvot? Well, we're good people. We're good in our heart. So the rabbi tried to speak and to teach them, but he had no avail. The story goes on to say that one day he calls and he says, there's been a great, tremendous person that has passed away. A great tzaddik has passed. And he wants the entire town to come to the funeral of this tzaddik. When everybody arrives, they see that the one that is being carried out, the tzaddik, the righteous person, is a sheep. And they turn to the rabbi and say, seriously, this is the tzaddik? He said, yes, this is the tzaddik. This sheep has never stolen. He's never insulted anybody. He's never embarrassed. He hasn't killed anybody. He's been a good sheep. he's done nothing wrong. He's only been good. So the story is that the message that they understood was that while it's important to be a good person, that's very important, but we also, it's not enough to be a good person. But not studying is the main thing, not the speaking is the main thing, but actually action. You have to do ultimately the right thing. So whether the connection to this particular Mishnah is that we have to find ways to stick out in our action. Action is what speaks greater than words. And that's why we have to be more cautious of the action that we do. But ultimately, remember that your action is your strength, what you have to do. What are you actually doing speaks louder than what you actually say. Okay, I'll pause there. If anybody has any questions or comments, disagreements, or feedback, please feel free.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Sorry to be controversial as usual.
Good.
So you you spoke about them reducing the number of doves required for a sacrifice because people were taking advantage and were profiteering from the whole situation.
Well,
so yeah.
Okay. I think I know where this direction you're going, but go ahead.
So in real terms, okay, at what point does somebody turn around and say, in terms of kosher food, that somebody is really profiteering and causing undue hardship on people who want to keep kosher and can't? At what point does it become relevant to our everyday lives, these fanciful, beautiful lessons that we learn when we have shiurim? When do they have real practical application?
Okay, so first of all, you have to be very careful with what you're saying, not to mix milk and cheese, not to mix, what's the saying?
Chalk and cheese.
Chalk and cheese, thank you.
Yes.
Not to mix chalk and cheese, because let's remember, there's something like this. There's never been an instance where the rabbi said, okay, kosher food is too expensive, therefore we can't do it, we're not going to buy from these people. It has happened that historically, that it happened a couple of times in Muslim countries. There's a famous story that in a Muslim country, um, the fishmongers, the fish sellers, they knew that every Shabbos the Jewish people were supposed to have fish for Shabbos, and they always sell a lot of fish. And then what they decided is that they were going to raise the prices. It's a famous story of one of the Sephardi Chachamim, one of these African countries. I can't remember where it was, and therefore they were going to raise the prices to be extremely high on Fridays or whenever it was Thursday, Friday, so that the Jewish people, there was no fridges, so that they would be forced to pay more. They could make a good buck off the Jewish people. So the Chacham in the time made a law: no one's allowed to buy fish for Shabbos. Okay, no one is allowed to buy fish. Why? Because people are taking advantage of the situation. He didn't say, okay, as a result, everyone should go eat non-kosher fish. He just said, don't buy fish today. Even though Torah law says that you should buy fish. And what ends up happening, he actually did another thing. It's a Sephardic, one of the Sephardic Kabbalistics. You don't mess with those people. He actually made this thing, and he went down to the sea, and he cursed the sea, and he said that the river, the lake, or the sea, wherever it was, that no fish should come up in that area. And the fishermen were not able to find any fish. I think I might be confusing two stories. There's another story where he cursed the sea, and therefore, why? Because they put up the price, so there was no fish for them to find until they promised to bring the price of the fish back down, and the fish came back into the sea. I think it's two separate stories, if I'm not mistaken. So what you're seeing is that there's time to be lax, but you've got to be careful. There's certain things when, for example, eating non-kosher, we only do in a life-threatening situation. Could the rabbis go up to somebody and say, listen, you're charging too much for kosher food, therefore you have to stop? They can. I do think that there is a little bit of a misconception over here in Melbourne that kosher meat is so expensive that therefore somebody's making a real money of us. I think that there could be elements of truth to that, but I don't think that it's entirely true, because besides the fact that we do have competition here in Melbourne, I could tell you that I could tell you firsthand that I know that There have been times that certain people have made good money off selling kosher food, but I don't think any of these people are raking it in and making millions. And the fact is that there is an issue whenever you have a small market. Prices will be very, very high. Besides the fact that you have to, in kosher meat, you have to employ extra people, you have to employ extra mashgichim. You need, every piece of meat goes through about 3 or 4 hands of rabbinical supervision, besides for the shechter that has to get paid. The one that has to be mashgiach to check the lungs is a separate person. There's another person, the butcher, called the person that has to do nikui. And then there's another person that has to do the salting. It's all done by mashgichim. These are all bonus things that are not done in a regular thing. That's besides for the fact that they have to have their own meat plant, etc. So I could tell you that, for example, Solomon's a couple of years ago went bankrupt because they simply couldn't afford to think, and eventually somebody bought them out and was able to save the store. And Solomon's is definitely not cheap. So I don't think that anybody is purposely trying to make the prices high. Could they at times make it lower? Possibly. Could they find better ways to do it? Um, or invite more competition into the market? Possibly. I don't know. Um, and what we should be doing is trying to find ways to make food more affordable. But we can never say, well, you see over here, he said that doves don't have to be brought um, because people were overcharging. He never said go and transgress the sin. I don't know of a situation where they said, okay, you know what, transgress the following sin because people are doing it. I don't know if I've answered your question, so I'll let you do a follow up to that question if you want to.
There's no follow up. I mean, obviously, I'm just prodding to try and get something that will put my mind at ease. And the fact of the matter is, you just have to walk into Coles and look at the cost per kilogram of treif versus kosher of the same cut of meat,
Yeah.
and you start doing numbers. You do the Jackie Mason thing. Well, if they shecht the X number of chickens in a day, and how many people do they need to be mashgichim, and what do they earn? You can see that there's definitely a lot more fat in it. And if there isn't fat in it, if people like Solomon's are going insolvent, then it's because they're running their businesses badly, in conjunction with overcharging. Okay, it's like the governments don't have to cut their cloth to suit. They just say, oh, well, okay, if my costs are X, then I'll just increase the taxes. Unfortunately, that's what happens. They turn around and say, well, my costs are X. They don't say, well, how do I reduce my costs? They often say, well, okay, so we'll just charge more.
I don't disagree with you, and that I'm not a business expert to be able to say I can go into Solomon's and tell them ways that how they can do it better. You're probably right that they could probably do their business better, but I'm just saying I don't think that there's anybody that. The fact is the fact is that when it comes to kosher meat, and anything that you have a small market, it's going to be much, much more expensive. Besides for the fact that kosher meat requires all the extra things that non-kosher meat doesn't require. When you get something mass produced in the non-kosher meat stores, it's going to be cheaper. You could go to a place and you could get people that are going to, the cheapest people out living in Laverton or wherever they work, whatever these abattoirs are, and the cheapest people willing to work for $15 an hour or whatever they get paid, and get them to just go through thousands of things, and just every single piece of meat is just done and goes through a system, boom, 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 boom. It's half the time, half the meat doesn't get used, and there's so many different variants when it comes to meat. So meat ends up becoming expensive. There's nothing I can do about it. We can do about it, and especially in Australia where labor is expensive and you have to.
But it's a worldwide phenomenon, really.
Well, yeah, it's a worldwide phenomenon. I could tell you that, for example, Israel, they get their meat from Argentina, where labor is cheap, and that they have abundance of meat. But all these places, each place has its own issues. And the place which is probably the cheapest to buy meat is America, because there's a massive market. I don't think it's because there's more competition. It's just simply there's a bigger market.
Yeah.
And easier to when you have a bigger
But
market.
that brings on another whole discussion of, well, if you bring the prices down, you'd increase the size of the market, because there's a lot of people who would love to keep kosher but can't,
That's
because
right.
the costs are prohibitive.
Well,
So
Yeah,
where's the will to do something like that?
that's right. Well, you need to get some people that are willing to do that. And I personally am really working towards that myself. I'm trying to find a way of how I can get affordable meat for people in our community that would like to go kosher or that are already kosher but can't afford that much meat.
Yeah.
I fully get that, and
Okay.
it's a real issue. Meat in Australia is expensive. And I agree with it. I just think that I don't think that anybody is purposely making a big buck on it.
But you can be kosher without eating meat, and you'd be better for the planet anyway.
That's what some people are doing. I have a family in our community, if that's willing to, but I personally, I can't 100% push that direction, saying that that's the Torah perspective. Number one, I'm not saying it isn't, but also I can't go and say, let's start pushing. It's not my job.
Nothing.
I'll leave
It should be your job, because your job is to look after the planet. That should be your first job, because God said, I'm putting you here to look after the planet.
David, with all due respect, I think we all have to. There's people that feel like that's their job, but I really could tell you, if my job was to make everybody vegan, I would not have a Chabad house.
No, I didn't say vegan at all. I didn't
Or
say anything of the
vegetarian.
fact. I just said
Or to
eating, not eating meat.
Everyone has their specialty. There's some people that have to focus on making people.
No, what I'm saying is, if
healthy.
Mark's argument or anyone's argument is too expensive to be kosher because of the meat story, well, you need to eat meat then once a week. What's wrong with that? And still be kosher.
100%.
Yeah, but listen, we do, to be honest, Dave, we do not eat meat more than once a week. Okay. But it still hurts like nothing on earth when you have to put in an order and it comes to $800 and 3 measly little boxes arrive, It really, really is beyond the pale. It's crazy.
Lucky you're not vegan.
So yeah, I don't know how. I know that over here, I know a couple of people. I was saying over here in Dingley, I know one or two families that were looking at coming more kosher, and they're already like half vegan type of thing.
But you don't have to be
fully
vegan. You could just be vegetarian. What's wrong with being vegetarian?
Vegetarian, 100%. 100%. I wouldn't push any of these agendas because there is sometimes that Jewish law actually pushes that. Like, for example, on Yom Tov, we're supposed to have meat. Is it an obligation? No. If it's too expensive, you have to do it? No. But on the other hand, by me pushing people away from meat, I would actually, as Mark just said, I would be making it more expensive for everybody else because I'll make the market smaller. So it's a double.
But you'd save the planet.
Well, that's another thing that I have to figure out what exactly how I'm playing. I've got, we each have to do our part to save that. But yeah, listen, there are options that out there. I know that there's another family that I've been recently in discussions with. They want to go kosher, and their biggest issue is the expense of a kosher meat and kosher food. It's an issue. It's an issue, and if you have any other ideas of how we could make it more affordable, then I could tell you that it's becoming easy in Australia. 10 years ago, when we first moved here, it was a headache to do kosher. You walked around with this book trying to find products. It's becoming easier. There's more available. There's more affordable. There's easier. They put signs up and they have apps. So this is becoming easier. And you're finding more and more that's kosher that is just mainstream products, right? All right.
And the last step is you just got to get Sydney and Melbourne to be on the same page. That's all.
Sydney and Melbourne. Which elements?
Well, I'll give you a very real example. I went to buy curry powder the other day. I said to my daughter, curry powder.
Okay.
I said, you do realize that the Keens isn't kosher. She says, don't worry about it. It's on the Sydney list. Now, if it's kosher enough for Sydney, why isn't it kosher enough for Melbourne?
Well, the question, hold on, does it say in the kosher one, not in Melbourne, Australia, not kosher?
In the Melbourne list, it's not listed. Keens is not listed.
Okay.
The go-to brand that you find on the shelf at Woolies and Coles is not listed as a kosher product. The mustard is by the same factory, but the curry isn't.
No, that could just be something that hasn't been updated.
Oh, listen,
They
I've
have
got a
lots of
real,
products. They have lots of products on the Kosher Australia list,
Yeah.
which are fully under Kosher Authority, which is Sydney. So there is a lot of crossover, and they do put on their list products that are Sydney-based kashrus.
So if you want to have some shalom in the community, then you should write an app that sources from either of those two lists and says, if you're happy to go by the other list, then this is kosher. Instead of having to look on one list, oh, it's not there, go and look on the other list.
There was actually somebody that was working on that, and then they decided that. So there's two parts to this concept, to this discussion. There's one element of this discussion is that they actually have disagreements in policy,
Yes.
which is fine because every kashrut authority has to have their own policies, which sometimes will have subtle differences. So sometimes they have disagreements in policy, and that's why we can have, for example, certain Slurpees from 7-Eleven apparently are kosher under Sydney. That's the most famous example, and not kosher under Melbourne, Australia, because it doesn't fit into the different policy guidelines that the one would have over the other. Now that's so. If that was the case, Melbourne would say, well, according to our policy, it doesn't fit into our policy of being kosher or whatever we have to do, or our checks or our factory checks, or so that's one thing. Now, then the ideal thing to do would be to follow your own community's rabbinate, because that's. But if you're looking for a place to be lenient and say, well, at least Sydney's kosher, so then you could do that, but that's your choice. But then there's many things that they don't have disagreements. It just happens to be that they purposely don't have crossover. There's tens of thousands of food factories, and ones that are New South Wales based, more or less, are under the Kosher Authority. Ones that are Victoria based generally are under Kosher Australia.
Give me a second. Sorry.
I've got to go, guys. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thanks, David.
See you next week.
See you next week. Yeah.
Why don't you just
Thanks.
go to that door? I'll get them to bring it to you over there. William, there's a pickup of a